Hello, my name is Mark Thomas, Course Director for ECW 3721, Children's Entertainment. In this video, we will begin to examine some of the concepts of writing for children ages 13 to 18, also known as young adult literature. What we will begin to see with literature for this age range is more complex narratives, fewer topics that are considered taboo, and generally not a whole lot of difference than what is written for adults. At these ages, children are having to learn what it means to be an adult, and the literature reflects this. So, looking into the next stages of developmental psychology, we're once again going to start with Sigmund Freud. Now, according to Freud, once a person hits puberty, he believes that he or she enters into the last stage of development, what he calls the genital stage. Now, for him, this stage goes from puberty till death. He did not believe that there was any more development past the genital stage. So this is where we stop with Freud. For Erikson and Piaget and other developmental psychologists, they believe that there are far more stages of development beyond this stage, but Freud stops here. At this point, Freud says that sexual interests of a person matures, which in turn allows the person to develop into the person they will be for the rest of his or her life. And so, in other words, if you remember in the latency stage, we talked about that children begin to seek interests outside of the house and hold. They start to begin to develop friendships and other relationships. But what they don't develop at that stage is sort of romantic and or sexual interests. In the genital stage, that is when this stuff comes along. We start to see the development of more complex emotions, which is where the idea of love is able to come in. So at this point, a psychologically healthy person will develop an interest in members of the opposite sex. Now, it's also important to note, if you remember some of my previous notes about how Freud really only studied boys because there wasn't a concept that girls were psychologically different than boys, this is another thing to take into consideration with his theories, was that we're still fighting the fight for, acceptance in a lot of ways of homosexuality, fighting for equal rights and things like that. But certainly back in Freud's age, in the Western world anyway, ideas of homosexuality were considered psychological issues. And so for him, if somebody was exhibiting interest in a member of the same sex, then that was a person who was disturbed. That was a person who had psychological problems. And therefore, as I said, a psychological healthy person now is developing sexual and romantic interest in members of the opposite sex. So, and while in this stage, while the focus here is still on the genitalia as we had in the phallic stage 2 stages previous, because sexual identity is maturing, then we're starting to look at things becoming more consensual and adult rather than solitary and childlike. A child in the phallic stage might on his or her own time, for lack of a better term, play with himself in order to try and figure things out. A more psychologically healthy person is now developing an interest in using his or her parts as a means to show attraction, show interest in other people. So as an extension of this development, a person's interest becomes less self-serving and more communal, being interested in cultivating deep friendships and romantic relationships. So, as I said before, Erikson and Piaget think development continues throughout a person's entire life, so they've developed stages beyond adolescence. Of course, we are a children's entertainment class, so we're going to stop with the children's development. We're not going to continue past this point, but it is important to note that Freud stopped after the stage of puberty, whereas other developmental psychologists have now taken it on beyond there. So, for Erikson, the last stage of childhood is just known as adolescence. At this stage in a person's life, the conflict here is identity versus role confusion. And ultimately he or she is essentially trying to answer the question, who am I and what can I be? Now, the idea here between identity and role confusion is that now children are moving into a stage where they have to learn how to become adults. They have to learn how to handle their own problems and exist in a world where they are essentially self-sufficient. They can take care of themselves. So what they're doing now is that all of the interests that they have been developing in the previous stages, they're now applying them to a wider world. And they're saying, what is it that I'm good at? And what is it that I can be successful with? What do I want to do ultimately with my life? You know, in other words, they're trying to find their social identity. The problem where role confusion comes in here, there's a couple of stages of role confusion. Is one, if they can't find anything that they're interested in, or at least interested enough in to commit to, then okay, there's a problem there. I can't find where I fit in life. I can't find where I fit in society. I've developed role confusion. And ultimately, you know, people then develop what Erikson, he's credited as creating the phrase, you might have heard of it before, called an identity crisis. I don't know who I am. I don't know what I want to be. This is where this is happening. It's a person who just cannot figure out their position in life. The other kind of half of role confusion is that role confusion often comes up because of outside pressures. You know, for example, you know, I want to be a writer. You know, you tell people I want to be a writer. Well, how many people have when you've told them that, looked at you a little weird and were like, why do you want to do that? You know, what kind of money can you do doing that? Like, you know, why don't you go into business? Why don't you go into something, you know, something useful, something practical, right? You know, that creates role confusion. You're getting societal pressure back on you to not do this role because, well, other things might be more useful. You know, another area of role confusion in the same sense, particularly where it comes with kids, is, you know, kids who grow up in a family that have a family business. Lawyers and doctors, this happens a lot to, but it can be any kind of business. You know, but, you know, how many, for example, sons grow up to join the family law firm and things like that? You know, in a lot of those cases, they were basically pressured or guided into doing that. They weren't really left up to their own devices to decide what they wanted to be in life. It was just from the moment everybody said go, well, he or she is going to grow up and take over the family business. That's where it's going to be. Now, if the child makes the decision, well, that's not what I want to be. I don't want to be a lawyer. I don't want to be a doctor. I don't want to run your computer store. You know, I don't want to take over the family landscaping business. Now we get role confusion because, of course, parents are just as likely as peers, if not more likely, to say, no, that's not the right kind of profession. Why don't you go do this instead? So this is another area where teens can develop role confusion. But through all of this, the ultimate goal of this stage for Erikson is that a child develops fidelity. Now, this is the ability to forge friendships and relationships despite any personal or sociological contradictions that might arise from such relationships. You know, so for example, you know, how many times have you seen a kid, or, you know, it happened to yourself when you were a kid, you know, you're 8 years old and you and so-and-so are playing together and you have a little mini fight and, well, I'm not going to be your friend anymore. I'm going to hate you forever, is essentially the response to it. Like that's how, as soon as there's a spark of negativity in there, you can't handle it. The idea is, I never want to see you again in my life. And it doesn't matter what that is. This person won't let you play with their toy, or they're bouncing the ball the wrong way, or something like that. And as adults, we look at that and think that's ridiculous, but that's the way kids think. And that doesn't mean that they really never see them again. I mean, maybe by the next day, or even 10 minutes later, they've made up and things are all great all over again. But, you know, there doesn't seem to be many stages of friendship there or whatever. What fidelity is, this is the more adult concept of friendship and of relationship. This is the idea where, well, I can be friends with somebody, or I can be, the boyfriend or girlfriend of this person, and maybe we don't think the same politically. I'm a Democrat and they're a Republican, or I'm a Christian and they're an atheist, or however it goes. But you know what? We're adults and we can agree to disagree. We don't have to let it affect our friendship. Maybe we get in fights about it every once in a while, but it doesn't have to be something that just ends our relationship. At least not from the outset, obviously. Now, Piaget's adolescent stage is called the formal operational. If you remember, his last stage was called the concrete operational, and we were developing basic forms of logic, but only in concerning sort of concrete operations, if you will, but concrete things that the child can physically see, touch, feel, whatever. Now we're starting to develop the idea of abstract thought. We're able to deal with things that aren't just part of the physical world. A person's thought processes at this point is going from grounded in the concrete to the ability to think more broadly than just what's there. People at this stage begin to develop more advanced use of logic, and able to think their way through, abstract concepts, develop problem-solving abilities, develop metacognition, which is the ability to think of the way you think. It's the ability to recognize, oh, I'm a visual learner. It's the ability to recognize, you know what, from the hours of 2 to 4 in the afternoon, I'm totally worthless. I crash energetically. I have no, I just can't do anything. So you know what, I'm going to make sure that I get all my important work done in the morning before that crash happens. That's all kind of metacognition. I know the way I work. I know the way I think. I can recognize this stuff. So in other words, people are developing complex thought. Now, for Piaget, he kind of considered the development of abstract thought to kind of happen through puberty, and then by the time you're kind of done with puberty, your abstract mind is fully developed. Modern developmental psychologists are starting to think that it's a much longer process now, and the idea at this point is that really, these higher stages of learning don't really finish developing until about your mid-20s. I know for myself, I can remember 2 stages as an undergraduate when my, academic writing in particular really almost seemingly overnight took leaps and bounds. I've always been a pretty decent writer, but all of a sudden, I thought I was a really good writer, and then all of a sudden one day I wake up and something clicks in my head, and everything that everybody had been trying to tell me about my writing all of a sudden made sense. And I said, oh my God, I get it now. I get it. And my writing took a gigantic leap. Well, a few years later, the exact same thing happened. I was writing at this intermediary level, and I thought I was a great writer. And then all of a sudden, one day, I woke up and another thing clicked, and all of a sudden, I was now understanding everything else everybody was telling me. And I got it, and my writing took another leap. And I don't know for sure, but I kind of feel like that this was part of that developmental process, that I couldn't take that leap yet because my mind wasn't ready for it yet. My writing may have been good for an 18, 19, 20-year-old, but it was limited in a way. Again, I'm talking academically here. Not so much creatively. That is affected in some ways, though I don't think it's actually affected as much. It kind of depends on what you're writing. But as I said, for myself, I definitely saw these jumps in kind of academic level, if you will. Through particularly my early to mid-20s, where things all of a sudden made sense where they didn't make sense before. For basically seemingly no reason. But The other important thing to understand, though, with these developments is that this is kind of the point where people start to think differently. Development for everybody up to kind of puberty is pretty much the same. You kind of see, okay, this is going to happen before this, and then this is going to happen before this, and then when we move, when we move on to this next stage, this is what's going to happen, and etc. And we can kind of say this happens for everybody. When the mind starts moving into the abstract, though, now it starts differentiating itself. And now you can really start to see differences in the way people think. That doesn't mean that as children, there aren't times when, oh, this person might be better at math and this person's better at English. I mean, those sorts of things kind of still happen. But those differences really start becoming profound when you move into puberty and when the mind starts developing these higher methods of learning. You get into this stage, and maybe, I like to think I'm a very good, I'm very good metacognitively. I'm very good at recognizing who I am, what I'm able to do, and things like that. But there are other areas that I struggle a little bit more with, whereas other people might be better at things that I'm better at. This is kind of the stage, as I said, when these things start to take shape. Now, the main facet of young adult stories is that generally the main character or characters go through kind of what's known as a coming of age in order to accomplish their goals. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that they're a child when the story starts and then an adult when the story ends, but it means essentially that the character begins the story, possibly physically as a child, but it doesn't have to be that way, but somebody who might still be childish, or somebody who is naive in some way. And then throughout the course of the novel, he or she will kind of learn about, will either physically grow up or learn about, oh my God, I didn't know this before, I didn't understand this before, or I have to grow into this role, and basically learn what it means and what it takes to be an adult, and therefore be able to handle problems on his or her own without the help of an adult figure. In children's books, 0 to 6, adults are authority figures and oftentimes are the problem solvers. When we get to middle grade books, adults are still authority figures, and generally in middle grade, the kids kind of handle the problems on their own, but a lot of times it's an adult telling them what it is that they need to do. The kid might ultimately then do it, but a lot of times it's the adult saying, okay, you need to go take care of this. This is what needs to be done in order to solve this problem. When we get into young adult, all of the important stuff now is being done by the kid. And part of the process, part of this coming of age process, is now learning how to think and handle things like an adult in order to be able to accomplish whatever he or she needs to do. So, so if you consider, for example, the first Star Wars movie, the one from 1977. I assume at least most people in here have seen it. But at the beginning of the movie, we have a teenage Luke Skywalker. He's living with his aunt and uncle, and he's dependent on them for his livelihood, right? He works on his uncle's moisture farm, and he has visions of great adventure and joining the rebellion and things like that, but he doesn't have the ability to do that. He has he's basically kind of stuck to the whims of his family. His uncle, of course, wants to protect him, but Luke's in a situation where he doesn't really have an opportunity to break away from him. But then ultimately, his aunt and uncle are killed. And so he's now given this opportunity to follow his desires and find this adventure. And he's with Obi-Wan Kenobi, and he follows him. And Kenobi becomes his mentor. And they meet Han Solo, and ultimately they go on to rescue Princess Leia, and they join the rebellion, and so on and so forth. And throughout each stage of this, he learns a little bit more, and he learns to handle himself a little bit more. And, so by the time they get to the Death Star, now Luke is kind of coming up with plans. Obi-Wan has gone off to take out the tractor beam and draw Vader away from them. And now Luke is the one who's kind of forced into this role of, okay, well, this is what we're going to do to go and get the princess and and get out of here. And then Kenobi is killed, so Luke really has to take on really a true leadership role, and he joins the rebellion and he joins the attack on the Death Star, and we kind of see the coming of age come to fruition there at the very end of the movie when he's the only one left to take on the Death Star, basically, when a few people before him have failed, and he trusts what Kenobi has told him to not just trust the ship to do all the work for him, but he's going to trust his own feelings. He's going to trust in the Force. He's going to trust his own abilities to be able to make this shot that nobody before him has been able to make. Therefore, he completes his coming of age. Of course, then Star Wars does really well. They make 2 sequels, and we kind of see that arc get extended out, and then fully completed at the end of Return of the Jedi when he manages to resist the Emperor's advances. But we see that coming of age in there. The Harry Potter books are kind of the same way. And the Harry Potter books are really interesting because, the books grow as Harry grows. But ultimately, Harry is, he kind of handles everything on his own and he figures a lot of stuff out. But throughout the entire series, he always has Dumbledore there to kind of point him in the right direction. Well, then but as the book goes along, he takes on more and more things independently. And ultimately, of course, Dumbledore is killed. Spoiler alert. And Harry kind of has to go it on his own. And, and we see his coming of age come to fruition there in the last book when, his goal is to find the Horcruxes that are keeping Voldemort alive. But he's got this other kind of side mission that he's really intrigued by in terms of finding the Deathly Hallows. Which he thinks might be able to help him as well. And he comes to this basically choice about 2/3 of the way through the book. All right, I've got a decision to make. I either need to go after the Horcruxes, which has been the plan all along, or go off on this potentially entirely fruitless quest to find these Deathly Hallows that may or may not help. And the Deathly Hallows are what his desire is, but at this point he's been through enough and he's learned enough to say, no, I can't keep with these childish desires. I've got to stay the course, and I've got to move on. And I've got to go after the Horcruxes. And of course, by going after the Horcruxes, he does then ultimately get his desires because he's able to unite the Deathly Hallows. But he does that as a happenstance, essentially, of going after the Horcruxes. So, now let's talk a little bit about the history of young adult literature. Young adult literature was the first sort of age range that we really kind of focused on in terms of writing for kids. But it's still overall a relatively new concept. As I talked about with Freud a few weeks ago, I talked about him as being sort of really one of the first people to study kids as something, as not adults, as something that are less than adults and that need to develop into adults. And he was the first person to really study that, but the idea had been kind of brewing there for a little while. And the idea of writing for young people started as early as the early 19th century. In 1802, a British author named Sarah Trimmer started a magazine called The Guardian of Education, which was all about essentially raising children. I mean, we have 500 of these magazines now that come out every week that have articles on, how to feed children, what to feed children, what kind of clothes to buy them, the things to expect in the middle of the night. And it's, and they're basically training manuals in a lot of ways for parents. Well, that's what The Guardian of Education was. It was the first attempt at one of these style magazines to give parents a way to learn about being parents without just having to experience it. Give them some knowledge to draw from so that when things would happen, they would know how to handle it. Now, in The Guardian of Education, she introduced the term books for young persons and talked about books that were good for teenagers. I mean, she was talking about kids from 14 to 21. recognizing the idea that this is kind of the time when kids are really starting to think, well, now, here are some books and here are some things that we could write speaking specifically to them. Unfortunately, it wasn't a term that really caught on, and it wasn't really a concept that caught on. And we didn't actually physically start writing for young adults, at least in terms of consciously doing it, until the 1970s. In 1967 or 68, a book came out called The Outsiders, now by S.A. Hinton. Now, the book The Outsiders is considered the first young adult novel. But it wasn't written as a young adult novel. When Hinton wrote The Outsiders, the idea of writing for young adults wasn't something that many people really thought about. And if you think about the typical publication cycle of a book comes out, and for the first, maybe couple of years that a book is out is when it generally sees its most sales. And then after a while, the sales start dwindling and petering out until eventually it doesn't really sell very much anymore. Well, a few years, about 73 or 74, that after, so we're talking 6, 7, 8 years after the publication of The Outsiders, Hinton and the publisher were noticing, hey, sales for this book are continuing to be really strong. Why is this? Now, The Outsiders, I say really strong, that's a little bit of a misnomer, because sales for The Outsiders never were it was never a blockbuster. But it was never dwindling. It started out at a certain level, and it just kind of stayed at that level, and they were very curious about that. Well, why is this? Why is this book continuing to sell? And so they started looking into it, and what they found out was that high school teachers were buying The Outsiders to give to their English classes, to have their classes read, because high school teachers were recognizing that, hey, this is a book that really can speak to a lot of kids. And the light went off, and they said, aha, here are some new marketing opportunities. Young adult literature, young adult became a genre of writing. Now, the idea behind young adult, though, isn't necessarily new. While the idea of marketing it that way is, we've seen young adult stories for years. Classic literature that we still bill as classic literature, like Treasure Island, Catcher in the Rye, Lord of the Flies, To Kill a Mockingbird, things like that. Those are all young adult novels from the modern definition of what young adult is. Now, because they came out before young adult was a thing, we even still now market them as classic literature. But they're absolutely young adult novels. So, as I said, in the 70s, this started becoming a thing, and it started kind of taking shape in the 1980s. In the 1980s, we saw young adult literature it became very realistic, very sort of message-driven. Similar to, we talked about needing to teach. Well, when we get to young adult, we're still teaching. And that's what the message driven is behind this. We saw stories of real things happening to real people, and there's some kind of moral behind it. So for example, Stephen King's short story, Stand By Me, that got turned into a movie. We have a group of teenagers. They have to learn the realities of death, as well as to learn how to stand up for themselves when confronted with danger or confronted with problems. We had, one of the non-realistic young adult novels that came out in the 1980s was Orson Scott Card's Ender's Game, which, was about this young boy. He was actually not even a teenager. In the movie that came out fairly recently, they accelerated him to being a teenager, but in the original book, he's only about 8 years old. But he goes through a young adult story. In that story, they're looking for, they're at a war with an alien race, and they're looking for the genius that can help them come up with the strategy needed to win this war. And they find it in this little boy named Ender Wiggin. And they really kind of push him to become the person that they need him to be. And unfortunately for Ender, he becomes very psychologically scarred because of that. But he does go through this coming of age where he really starts to take charge of this very adult world. So now by the 1990s, young adult literature started becoming much edgier because authors really began to examine really troubling concepts as part of coming of age stories. Really kind of really bad things to happen to people, if you will, that do happen to some children. In the 1980s, they still shied away from a lot of things, but by the 1990s, now we're starting in young adult literature. We're really starting to explore concepts of rape and murder and and things like that. There was a book called Running with Scissors, which was a memoir by a guy by the name of Augusten Burroughs. And now Augusten Burroughs, it needs to be noted, is a pen name, and he admits that because he's changed all the names in his book because some really horrific things happen in his book, and he doesn't want to incriminate anybody. So he's also he changes his own name so that people hopefully can't trace things backward and find out who these people are. But part of his coming of age is as a teenager he realizes that he's gay, and it's the older son of some family friends that kind of help him come to this realization. And he has his first sexual experience with this man. Augustin is about, I think, like 14 or 15 at this point, and this older son is actually about in his mid-20s, and he has his first sexual experience with the man, where he, through oral sex, and it's very graphically told about how everything that happens in this experience. He doesn't shy away from the details. Then we have books like Monster by Walter Dean Myers, where in this book it's presented as an autobiography, but it's really it is a work of fiction, but it tells the tale of a kid living in Brooklyn who's been arrested, an African-American kid, it should be noted, who's been arrested as being part of a murder, where he maintains his innocence, and a lot of the things that he comes up against socially and politically and in the justice system that are kind of going against him, because he is an African-American inner-city kid. Things that, say, for example, a white kid living in the suburbs maybe wouldn't be confronted with. So, now by the 2000s, we start moving away from the edginess a little bit. And it's not that we avoid talking about things like rape and murder and things like that can happen to teens, but now we're not being quite so. It wasn't, for, as I said, from in Augusten Burroughs' memoir. He was very graphic about his sexual experiences. Well, those sexual experiences in a book that comes out now, that comes out sort of since the 2000s, might still be there, but the graphicness might not be there. We might, for lack of a better term, kind of dance around the issue a little bit more. Now, we still get the really edgy books. For example, in Adam Rapp, a young adult and children's author, wrote a book called 33 Snowfish, which is kind of a stark look at ideas of homelessness and child molestation and things like that. It's about a couple of kids who are homeless, and a man in their neighborhood has given them shelter, given them a place to live. They're not officially adopted by them, but he's given them this opportunity as a means to be able to have his way with them. And so, it's kind of about their ability to get away from that. And they go through some really traumatic experiences. And here in Rapp, again, is very graphic in his detail and things like that. So those sorts of books can still come out, but for the most part, we're staying away from the graphicness of it anyway. We're also seeing in the 2000s more of a fantasy and dystopian turn. I talked about Harry Potter a little bit already. That's fantasy. We have dystopia in Veronica Roth's Divergent series and in the Hunger Games series by Suzanne Collins. Um, so, and but and that's what we see kind of more coming out these days. That doesn't mean it's always going to be that way, but right now that seems to be what's really popular. And of course, it should be noted that in the early 90s, Lois Lowry actually kind of made this popular herself. We started seeing this crop up in the 90s. Didn't become really big until the 2000s, but Lois Lowry wrote the novel The Giver, and that's where this kind of trend really started kicking off. The thing with young adult literature, though, is that historically it's faced a certain obstinance from the literary community about its applicability to anything other than for its intended audience. There's this kind of idea of, well, young adult literature, children's literature in general, well, it's easy to write. Look, it's really simple vocabulary. It's really easy to write. Of course, I would argue that it's actually more difficult to write because you have to be stopping and thinking about everything that you're trying to say. And then there are going to be ways that you're going to have to reword things. You can write how you want to for adults. For kids, you really have to stop and think how it is that you're writing. And that's also part of the reason why you don't hear about like Treasure Island or Catcher in the Rye being talked about as young adult fiction, because these are classic literature. So again, there's kind of from certain aspects of the literary community, there's kind of like a derogatory approach towards young adult and children's literature. Of course, the other problem with that these people take towards, in particular, young adult literature is they say, well, I'm a teenager. I'm not a teenager, so this book isn't for me. What can I get out of this book? I'm not, to which I would respond to them, well, are the entire audience of Harry Potter, for example, teenagers? Harry Potter didn't sell billions of copies because teenagers got on board with it, and kids didn't get on board with it. Of course they did, but Harry Potter sold as much as they did because adults got on board with it too. They found things in it that were interesting. They found the stories exciting. They got stuff out of it. So, young adult literature does have an appeal for all ages, but there is, as I said, this kind of obstinance from certain aspects of the literary community towards it. Again, we're starting to see this shift, though. I mentioned Harry Potter. We see people reading and being more interested in what's coming out in the young adult world. And to speak to that, Nick Hornby was for a long time, he's an author, and for a long time wrote literary fiction, and was one of those people that kind of denigrated children's literature and didn't think there was any real value to it until he had an opportunity to experience some of it, and he realized how good it could be, and now he is a young adult author. But he had this quote that I really like. He says, "I see now that dismissing YA books because you're not a young adult is like refusing to watch thrillers on the grounds that you're not a policeman or a dangerous criminal. And as a consequence, I've discovered a previously ignored room at the back of the bookstore that's filled with masterpieces I've never heard of." I love that quote, and I think that sums it up perfectly. Young adult literature, yes, we are writing for teens. That has to be our intended audience. That has to be who we're focusing on. That has to be who we're writing to. But it's just as universal as any other kind of writing. It can have a broad appeal. It doesn't just have to be for teens. So let's take a quick look at some of the basic differences between middle grade and young adult fiction. Now, we talked about it in middle grade fiction, for example, that your plots could be a bit more complex than with children. But one of the things I did mention, if you remember, is that you don't often get very much, having like an A story and a B story. Most of the time, we're still kind of focused on one thing. Uh, and your plot lines tend to still be very linear. You start at the beginning, you go through the book, and you end at the end. With YA, you can start introducing multiple plot arcs. You can be more experimental and start your story in the middle, or something like that, or kind of bounce around a little bit, things like that. Um, in middle grade literature, relationships between your characters are generally more friendships, even among, boy girl, and things like that. They tend to be strong friendships. And maybe there can be a hint of puppy love in there, which what I mean by puppy love, if you're not familiar with that term, is that puppy love is kind of like a love that a child feels for somebody else that mimics true love, or romantic love, if you will. A child, children can't really feel romantic love. Their emotions haven't developed in that way yet. But they see this concept of love, and to an extent they understand this concept of love, and at times they feel like they feel this concept of love. But what they're doing is they're really mimicking love, and what they're mimicking is kind of the outward expressions of love. They don't really have what's going on kind of underneath. And so in books and TV and things like that, their relationships tend to be friendships. You don't see a whole lot of couples in middle grade literature. In YA literature, absolutely. Friendships are deeper, and you do have relationships. You do have couples. You do have, whatever. Middle grade literature, you're still looking at really simple vocabulary. Whereas in YA literature, yeah, you can get a lot more sophisticated with your language. And you know what? Characters swearing is fine generally too. Now, it can't be gratuitous swearing. I'm sure we've all seen movies where people are swearing and it just seems, every other word is F this and F that and whatever. And it just, it just kind of gets old and it's just kind of thrown in there to have it. That's generally not okay in YA. But general swearing, yeah, you know what? It's kind of cool. It's fine. Middle grade literature, you kind of have to come to a resolution. The story has to be complete. We have to know what happens, at least partially, because children can't deal with any more than in the concrete. If you leave something open to interpretation, they can't do that. With YA, you can leave things a little more open-ended. Kids are getting to the point where they can deal with interpretation and trying to come up with their own ideas of what happened here. So you can be a bit more open-ended. And then, lastly, your protagonist. Now, one of the things I haven't talked a whole lot about to this point is that in any kind of kids' literature, for the most part, your protagonist is going to be roughly the same age as your intended audience. So if you're going to write for 10-year-olds, then your protagonist is probably going to be about 10 years old. Because you're looking for characters that are relatable. Whoever you're writing for, you're looking for characters that are relatable for your intended audience. Well, who do kids relate to? Other kids. They don't relate to adults with adult problems. You can get away with having adults as your protagonists, but their problems need to be problems that kids can understand. Problems of, I got laid off from my job and I can't pay my bills isn't something that, a 10-year-old is really going to be able to follow. Has to be something that a kid can understand. So, same thing, when you get to YA, your protagonist is generally going to be a teenage protagonist, and that teenage protagonist is going to have teenage problems. So that's something to keep in mind as well. So, with all this in mind, let's take a look at what we have to consider for when writing for a young adult audience, okay? Now, in terms of books, we're starting to get longer. We're starting to get to the point where anything goes. Not entirely anything goes. As I talked about before, for example, we've kind of moved away for the most part from really graphic depictions of sex or violence or things like that. But the idea of them being in there is okay. And readers at this point, are looking for longer and more complex stories. So now we're looking at sort of a maximum of about 90,000 words for young adult literature. About 300 pages is kind of what we're looking at. Again, that's sort of an absolute maximum. That's for your older young adult novels. Somewhere in the 60 to 90,000 word range, somewhere between 200 and 300 pages is kind of what you're looking at. We can also start at this point looking at the difference between literary and genre fiction. Young adults can start to get into literary fiction a little bit, where that's going to be really troubling for younger kids. So you need to think about, are you going to write something that's stark and more true to life, like Adam Rapp's 33 Snowfish, like Augusten Burroughs' Running with Scissors? Do you want to write something that's a bit more fantastical, something that might be sci-fi or fantasy or horror, something like, Hunger Games, Harry Potter, things that we just also discussed a little bit earlier. And as I also kind of mentioned, as with adult fiction, literary fiction generally tends to garner more critical praise. People who take reading really seriously tend to have more of a draw towards literary fiction. But genre fiction tends to have more opportunities to make more money. You get the more popular crowd behind genre fiction. So you kind of need to think, what approach do I want to make here? Again, with young adult novels, definitely more so than children's and middle grade, you're almost always going to want a teen main character. You can get away with adults as your main character, particularly in middle grade, again, depending on what their situation is. But by the time you get to young adult, you're probably going to have teens as your main character here. We also tend to want to get to know our characters a lot. You find in young adult, it's not a hard, fast rule, but a lot of young adult novels tend to be first person. Because that allows us to really get to know your main character. And again, we're looking for characters that are relatable. Well, the best way to relate to them is to really get to know them. Best way to really get to know them is to tell the story in first person. So that's why a lot of them tend to be in first person. Again, not a hard, fast rule, but it generally works out that way. Similar for that for similar reasons, young adult novels tend to be pretty dialogue heavy. A lot of people talking. That's how they advance the story a lot. You don't get, even in the literary world of young adult fiction, you don't tend to get long passages of exposition. So they get that information out instead through dialogue. And again, as we said, we're kind of getting to a point now where there's really not a whole lot that you can't write about. If you want to delve into some really serious topics, then generally go for it. You might just have to be careful about how you approach it. Moving on to teen television, we have some of the consideration of both YA books as well as some of the advancement of things that we looked at in going from children's to middle grade TV. Similar to the literary versus genre debate in books, for TV, we have the fantasy versus reality debate. We can do something that's fantastical, or we can do something that's set in real life. Is your TV show going to be something that takes place, in a generally real setting, such as like the first season, for example, of The Secret Life of an American Teenager? That dealt with teen pregnancy in a very real way. Or are we going to go something with like The Vampire Diaries, which packages teen issues in more of a fantasy wrapper with the vampires? Or possibly you might fall somewhere in between, kind of something that's maybe even a little bit more soap opera-ish, such as the later seasons of The Secret Life of an American Teenager, or maybe even something like a Beverly Hills 90210, or something like that, where it's taking teen issues, but it's really kind of dramatizing them in sometimes really extreme ways and unrealistic ways. But it's still kind of attacking them in exploring them. Shows for teens can be longer. We're now getting where we can do hour-long time slots. We can do an hour-long TV show. And not only can we do an hour-long TV show, we can serialize them. In other words, I can tell a story that's going to take a season to complete. Maybe each episode has its own little individual narrative arc, but then over the season altogether, it tells one story. Of course, it doesn't even have to have each episode has one individual story arc. You can just have it all serialized. Now, most YA shows are still episodic, but you can do more serialized stuff. As I discussed last week, though, you really don't have a whole lot of opportunity to write for cartoons at this level. If you're going to write teen television, then you're looking at live action stuff. It's just, the way it is. It's the way the industry works. But another thing that we need to think about, as I talked about with books, you generally having a teen protagonist, we also need to consider the role of adults, and this does actually work with books as well. As mentioned before, the adults in children's books, they are voices of authority. They are role models. They are oftentimes, the voice of reason. They're the problem solvers, right? They can be main characters in your books, in your TV shows. In middle grade, the kids often take on a bit more of the responsibility, but you've still, in a lot of ways, got adults pointing them in the right direction. You've got adults saying, go over here and do this, and the kids have to go do it, but the adults are the ones kind of doing all the heavy thinking. When we get to young adult, unless an adult is your antagonist, adults are starting to take a back seat now. They can be a voice of reason, they can be a sounding board, they can be sympathetic characters, but they are not main characters. Remember, the goal of young adult stuff is to have this coming of age story. It's to have kids have to learn and figure out how to handle things like adults. And having adults help them get to that point isn't the way to do it. They have to do it themselves. Adults might be able to get them started on that. Adults might be able to help them at points along the way. But ultimately, it comes down to your teenage protagonist handling things for him or herself. So with the teen being in charge now, stories also tend to be a bit more character-driven. Remember, we're looking for characters that we can relate to. It's not that the plot isn't important, because it is, but it's the characters coming of age that means the most in young adults, whether it's TV, films, or books, because that's the catalyst for them to be able to solve their own problems. And again, heading into film, we see a lot of the same considerations that we had seen previously. Once we hit the teenage years, films start to take more of an all-audiences approach. For example, Divergent is technically a film for teens. However, it's approached in a way that adults can see it as well and still enjoy it. Its themes are universal. Harry Potter and the Hunger Games are the same way. In some cases, even, a younger crowd might still be able to see and enjoy it, though some of the more complex themes might go over a child's head. So because of this, we never see films for teens with a rating over PG. You will never see a rated R film that is a young adult film. Now, part of this is business driven. Think of the rated R. Think of rated R. It's a film that is for kids and people that are 17 years or older. Think of young adult. Young adult is 13 to 18. If you make a young adult movie rated R, then you are alienating more than half of your potential audience. You're limiting your young adult audience there. You make it PG-13, any young adult can see this thing. So the other problem with rated R, of course, is that a lot of the themes that are introduced into movies that become rated R their themes become no longer universal. They're things that are specifically intended for adults, things that the teens maybe aren't necessarily equipped or can even understand happening. With PG-13, we're still in that boat. So now at this point, we're talking at this point movies sort of an absolute maximum of 2.5 hours in length, but we're generally about 2 hours in length, which was, if you remember, the absolute maximum for middle grade. For some of the more recent films, I mean, we've seen them getting, particularly the really popular films like the Hunger Games movies, like the Harry Potter movies, we're seeing them push the 2:30 boundary a bit more, but you're generally still looking sort of at the 2-hour length. Just like books and TV shows, we're looking at a teen-driven plot, but teens can be supported by adults. And the other thing that's happening right now in teenage film is we're very rarely seeing new young adult films come out that are entirely new properties. What we're seeing is a lot of films being based on books, already successful books. And again, that's kind of a business reason behind that. Because movie studios are looking at ways that they can guarantee that their investment's going to come true. If they're going to invest $100 million, then it helps them to know this is already a popular property. They're willing to invest hundreds of millions of dollars into, say, Harry Potter, because Harry Potter is already a blockbuster book series. They're willing to do the same thing for Hunger Games. They're willing to do the same thing for plenty of other things because they know the books have sold well. So there's already an audience for these people, for these stories, sorry. They don't need to go and find an audience for them. You write a book for you write a movie for teens, sorry, that isn't based on a book. Now they have to go find an audience and essentially cross their fingers that that audience can be found. So if you have plans on writing a young adult movie, it doesn't hurt to think about maybe writing a novel first. Then you can translate it into a movie. So, thank you again for watching and listening to this video. If you have any questions about anything that I have presented here, please don't hesitate to ask. Thank you.